Good evening and welcome to a new episode of our program, The Daily Debates. So Monday evening, I'm Yasmin Bakir. Tonight we're going to be talking about the Egyptian-South Sudanese relations. And of course, in a meeting with the South Sudanese Vice President, last week, President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi had affirmed Egypt's commitments in providing its fellow African state with all the technical assistance that it needs, whether it's in the field of agriculture, trade, industry, energy, education, and even health. And of course, in return, the South Sudanese Vice President visited Egypt to attend the meetings of the Supreme Joint Committee formed after President Sisi's visit to Juba in November. And it was also accompanied by a number of ministers who are also meeting with their Egyptian counterpart. This is all part of the integration in the field of investment, exchange of expertise, training, trade exchange, energy and infrastructure, and all in means of strengthening the relationship between Egypt and South Sudan on all levels. We'll be back right after this report. Please stay tuned.
تحية تقدير واحترام لبطل حقيقي. البطل ده هو مصر وشعبها. الحكاية مش حكاية لا حكومة ولا قيادة، ده حكاية كل مواطن في مصر. أكرمت مصر وشرفت مصر وعزيت مصر، انتم قتلتم. فالشرف كل الشرف والكرامة كل الكرامة والفضل كل الفضل لله سبحانه وتعالى، ثم ليكم انتم. شرفتوني واكرمتموني وعزتوني ورفعتوا راسي قدام الدنيا كلها باللي انتم عملتوه. والله 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 لن يستطيع اي رئيس يقف مكاني هنا انه يقدر يعمل حاجه بدونكم. لن يستطيع. قصه وطن يتحدث عن نفسه، شعب أراد الحياة فاستجاب له القدر.
Abdel Fattah al-Sisi reiterated earlier last week that Egypt would continue to offer technical assistance to South Sudan in all fields. The president's remarks came during a meeting with South Sudanese Vice President for Economic Affairs James Wani Iga in Cairo. President al-Sisi discussed with Iga ways to benefit from Egypt's experience in supporting development, whether in agricultural production, irrigation, health or infrastructure. He expressed his appreciation for the holding of the first exhibition of Egyptian products in Juba this month, as well as the efforts to move forward with opening a branch of the University of Alexandria in South Sudan. The president also talked about the latest developments in the region, especially the latest developments with the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, reasserting Egypt's position regarding signing a legally binding agreement on the operation and filling policies for the dam. For his part, South Sudan's Vice President Iga discussed the latest developments in his country and highlighted Egypt's role in ensuring stability in the region and in South Sudan. Iga delivered President Salva Kiir's best regards to President al-Sisi, conveying his country's huge appreciation for Egypt, its people and leadership. The South Sudanese Vice President also expressed his appreciation to the Egyptian people and government for the humanitarian aid sent to his country.
Welcome back again. You're still watching us here on The Daily Debate. I'm very much delighted to have joining me in the studio this evening Dr. Mohamed Fahmy, Professor of Political Science at the American University in Cairo. Thank you for joining us, Doctor.
Thank you, my pleasure.
We're talking about the Egyptian-South Sudanese relations, but of course this is a gateway to the Egyptian strengthened ties with the rest of the African country. Of course, we do know that South Sudan is a special case because of its political situation. It's also on an economic level, needs a lot of support. Egypt is providing this support to South Sudan. So if we would talk about, for the start, about the meeting, the round meeting that was held between Egypt and South Sudan under the Egyptian-Sudanese Joint High Committee to enhance the bilateral cooperation. How do you see the progress in this regard?
Well, I mean, first of all, thank you for having me. This is a very important topic that unfortunately hasn't been really given sufficient attention in the media and in the public circles. One of the first, and I mean, if you look at the meetings that were held over the past few days, you'll find that one of the topics that were tackled, as usual, the industry and development and bilateral relations. This is, I think, for any kind of meeting as such, these will be the topics or issues that will be raised. But on the other hand, also very importantly, Egypt signed a specific agreement with the Southern Sudanese government to help build the capacity of the authorities in the southern part of South Sudan against the floods that may be happening. And this is really important.
Which is what they're expecting nowadays. I think in Sudan they're expecting it to take place tomorrow.
Exactly. In terms of infrastructure, this is very important. And it cannot also be not linked to the issue of the Jerd, which is affecting all of the African continent and the Nile Basin, not just Egypt. We're talking about Sudan proper. And
Egypt and Sudan, basically.
and Southern Sudan. So both of the countries were previously, of course, just one nation state. Today they have two different nation states on the borders, but both may be impacted by the Jerd. So here Egypt is stretching its arm not only to help these countries, which is very important, but also to highlight the fact that it's supportive of their well-being, of their right to development and right to enhance their resources, while at the same time also working with them to protect them from the dangers and the risks, the imminent risks of the Jerd.
So basically this agreement, and as you've correctly said, because of it pouring again to the Jerd file, how do you evaluate the cooperation between Egypt and Sudan, South Sudan specific, during the past couple of months in particular, especially that South Sudan has, as I said earlier, is facing many hardships on all levels?
Yes, South Sudan is one of the poorest countries in the world today in terms of Human Development Index. If you look at most of the indicators in terms of education, health, income, all of these indicators are drastically low. So it is a country in need of huge support in pretty much all aspects of life: industry, agriculture, irrigation, infrastructure. All of these, I think, sectors need strong support. Their northern neighbor, Sudan, which was their mother nation only a few years ago, is not doing much better. It's doing better on a small scale, but also it's facing its own issues. So Egypt here, I think there's a lot to be invested in terms of resources. South Sudan is also very fertile lands. We were talking about a potential for infrastructural development in terms of agriculture, in terms of investment also from Egypt, from private companies. So there's a lot of potential here to be exploited.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was just about to ask you about the strategic importance of South Sudan to Egypt from a political perspective at first sight and from an economic perspective.
Yes. From a political perspective, first and foremost, we have to remember that the history of this nation is still very new. It's a nation state that was established in the early 2010s after its independence from Sudan, a long history of civil war there, and also internal conflict even within South Sudan itself, the different factions. So it is definitely in the best interest of Egypt, given its close proximity both to Sudan and Ethiopia and the Nile Basin, that there is stability in the country, that there's development, and that when these elements of progress are taking place, Egypt has to be perceived as a supporting country, as a friend rather than a foe. Because, again, this is an investment that will likely yield results on the medium and long term when it comes to issues like, confronting other countries in the region like Ethiopia, also building and forging strong relations with the Nile Basin as a whole, Kenya also on the borders, Rwanda, Burundi, all of the countries of the Nile Basin. It's really important here. I think it's a very similar experience is also witnessed with other countries in the region as such.
Dr. Mohamed, now there will be no development if there is no stability. And as you've correctly said, South Sudan has had a history of civil war, conflict and grudges with Sudan itself, the mother nation at the beginning. So how far has Egypt succeeded in maintaining the stability and maintaining peace within South Sudanese different tribes and on an internal level, and of course with its neighbor Sudan, because without that I don't think that it's logical to go forward with investment projects. So how far has Egypt succeeded with your perspective in this regard?
Well, Egypt has kept very strong ties with the SPLA, the main ruling party in South Sudan, even during the civil war itself, when there was conflict between the two countries, because again, it was very important strategically and historically for Egypt to play this role in the conflict. So even before independence of South Sudan, Egypt was perceived as a friendly neighbor. And it did play a big role in the peace process that happened there and the negotiations that took place between the different factions there, even before the independence of South Sudan. After the independence, I think for a while, because of, again, what happened after the 2011 revolution in Egypt, the country wasn't still able to play or flex its muscles proper as it should. But after that, when Egypt started developing its assets in that regard, I think the relationships have been very strong. And it's perceived right now, again, as I just mentioned, that Egypt is a friendly nation. And this can be exploited further in terms of working with the different factions, because again, there's still a lot of instability within South Sudan. And
I'm glad you mentioned that, and pardon me for interrupting you, because I was just about to ask you, what guarantees does Egypt have when it comes to ensuring that the South Sudanese government, and on an official level, is abiding by the peace processes that have been signed, whether in South Sudan or outside South Sudan?
I think continuous monitoring and engagement, involvement is the main guarantee. There's no absolute guarantee with most of the African countries because, again, instability is still there because of so many different factors, ethnic, sectarian, historical, you name it. The tribalism still in a lot of nation states in Africa is a main cause of concern and of conflict. So for Egypt to be involved, engaged, witnessing, monitoring these events from very close proximity, that's very important, that we don't look the other way or forget about these nations. But being there, being involved, so that when a conflict erupts from the onset or from just features of it, you're able to be involved and to, again, hold positive relationships with all the different factions, not to be perceived as more friendly to one over the other. And it's not an easy game at all, but I think for the most part, over the past few years, Egypt has been playing it right with most of the African
And that's, of course,
nations.
because Egypt does not have any personal interests when it comes to the internal affairs of countries, as you said, they're on friendly terms, wanting to maintain peace. Political solution is always
not when it comes
to
the internal factions within these countries, but of course Egypt does have its interests in the Nile Basin, which is not very far from these countries. So it's in the best interest of Egypt for there to be stability and for there to be strong governments that are able to implement the rule of law and to, be powerful enough executively.
Apart from implementing law and abiding by agreements, with you correctly saying that South Sudan is one of the very poorest countries in Africa at the moment, if you want to rise up this country and further develop it, and especially with all the tribes, I mean, what files come first? Is it health before education? Is it education before health? Is it investment? Are they mega projects? I mean, how would you hierarchically put them in order?
Well, the starting point actually is monitoring and being a powerful nation state, building the institutions of the state, and which brings us back to the issue of the legal framework or to the rule of law, because unless you have a strong nation state that's able to implement its own sovereignty over its borders, and then after that the country will be able to take decisions, to uphold elections, for instance, to manage mega projects, cooperate with other countries. Unless this sovereignty is established properly over all of its territory, it will be very difficult for the nation state or for the government to do any business. And I think Egypt is really working with them in that department very well, that the state itself has to strengthen itself, and this can only happen via infrastructural development, via strong institutions within the nation state, a police authority, an army, ministries that are able to function properly. And that's a big challenge.
Now, apart from being part of the African continent, apart from Egypt always on various occasions being very supportive to lifting up the entire African continent forward in terms of development, yet it's always a win-win situation, it's always a give-and-take situation. So we do understand what South Sudan needs, but then what would Egypt need in return from South Sudan, even in an economic level, that would benefit Egypt and its nations at the end of the day?
I think, for starters, having this kind of presence in South Sudan guarantees Egypt a friendly nation state in a very critical and sensitive part of the African continent. This strong bond between the two countries and between the officials of both countries is definitely a great asset for Egypt to build on. We have to, again, remember that the location of South Sudan is very critical here because, again, it's surrounded by all of the countries of the Nile Basin. And not very long ago, Egypt had very tense ties with not only with Ethiopia, but also with other countries in the Nile Basin when they signed the Entebbe Agreement in the 90s, which acted as eventually, as we knew later, as a precursor to the JERD to be built by Ethiopia. So not having this again, not having African countries from Central Africa, conspiring almost against Egypt because of its absence and because of its lack of support to these countries, I think that's a big asset for us to build on. And, there is competition today because you have other regional players from different parts of the world, like Turkey, for instance. You have China, you have other countries that are interested when there are developing countries, that there is potential in these countries for development, for progress, for investment. So this is also definitely a great benefit for Egypt.
I'm glad that you mentioned the region because we do understand that South Sudan is very much indulging in its own internal issues and difficulties on all levels, whether it's poverty or health conditions and so forth. But if we want to talk on a regional level, do Egypt and Sudan share the same views regarding the continent as a whole, the various issues in the continent, the African continent apart from GERD? What else are they aligning with when it comes to African continent?
Well, I think here, the interests of both countries, there's no need really, apart from in addition to the issue of the JERD, for both countries not to be in agreement. Again, having a stronger African Union, for instance, working on conglomerates like the COMESA, like the other groups for furthering bilateral and multilateral cooperation and industry and trade in the continent, all of these I think there is a great benefit that South Sudan can really, be granted from these strong ties in the different sectors. And I think for most of the African continent, again, having, with smaller countries, so to speak, countries that are still building themselves, they don't usually have a very strict or firm viewpoint on the main issues because they're prone to infiltration from regional and global powers. So again, there's an opportunity here by working with them in this very critical initiation almost phase of building their own nation states. There's potential here to make sure that as they start building their character almost internationally, as they start forming more solid and clear-cut stances in terms of international relations, that these stances align with your own interests.
I'm glad you mentioned COMESA because I think it's an opportunity here to ask you about the greater picture here when it comes to the free trade agreement between the African continent, which has for long been very they've been talking about it for years, but nothing has really happened. We see countries ranging all the way from really poor countries to really wealthy countries in Africa, and still this issue of regulating the trade between the African continent is becoming very rigid with the different currencies and powers. And of course, as you say, there are other forces that are also interfering, and especially terrorist organizations in Nigeria, for instance, and in Somalia. So it's still tensed over there. We have other countries in Africa who are still in their internal tribal civil conflict. We have Libya, for instance, a big land changes in Tunisia as well. So it seems to be that this is going to take forever to actually happen. Do you see it possible to happen someday?
Yes, I mean, all of these issues are definitely there. We can, as you mentioned, some of these examples, and we can maybe add more examples to the turmoil happening in different African nation states. But at the same time, there are also success stories in several places in Africa, and there's great potential. So at this moment, I think it's really good for Egypt to be involved on both fronts. I mean, first of all, trying to de-escalate or trying to work with more nation states in Africa, like South Sudan, like Rwanda, like, also recently Djibouti, for instance, a country that was for a very long time almost, ignored from most of the players there. These attempts to forge positive relations with the different nation states and ensure their stability can only help in them becoming more active players in development and investments. And because again, as we mentioned, both aspects are really interlinked. Having a stable political system and an efficient state that's capable of controlling its own sovereignty is definitely also linked to having more progress and more room and potential for economic development.
As you said, there have been countries in Africa that Egypt has been very far off from for several years, and that's why under the leadership of President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, you've seen Egypt being a strong supporter to the entire African continent. Like, for instance, in 2020 alone, the president took part in 17 summits, including 11 on all related to Africa, and that had changed momentum in terms of the relationships and between memorandums of understandings that were signed on all levels, and primarily was the infrastructure and roads, for instance, and so forth. How has that changed the face of Africa during the past 7 years at least? And as you said, there are other countries like China, for instance, very interested in the African continent. How has that made it more encouraging for these countries to invest in Africa?
I think it's the progress or the change in Egypt's relations with the African continent over the past few years is there for all to see, really. And if you discuss it with any people from the different, especially sub-Saharan Africa, because historically, since the 1970s, Egypt has taken this different approach, different from what, for instance, during the 1950s and 60s, when Egypt was the champion of Pan-Arabism and even Pan-Africanism and development and post-colonial experience of building nation states and getting rid of the imperialism in the African continent. In the 1970s, and especially under President Sadat, there was an Egypt first policy that Egypt is the most important priority in our foreign policy, and we shouldn't get involved in too many files. And this really harmed the position and
and it had delayed the development of Africa,
of course,
because everybody else was just ripping off all the resources in Africa without any return for the benefit of these nations. And
what's happening today from other countries, like you mentioned, China, India, Turkey, even countries that were
Israel as well,
Israel, definitely, countries that were previously not part or not even present. This gap was there to be exploited, and it was exploited by other powers. However, if you listen to what most of sub-Saharan Africans would say, that this potential was there to be exploited, and you guys weren't there for it. We want Egypt to be present. We want to work with Egypt. There's a very strong and positive legacy for Egypt in Africa, and I think over the past few years, Egypt has started to regain this natural position almost. It will take years still to almost undo what happened before and to try and now compete with these powerful actors. But it's always important to start, and I think this start is happening now. Yes,
I want to stop on a number of points here. Let's first talk about January last year, where President el-Sisi took part in the UK Africa Investment Summit, and where he specifically said during the summit that there were promising and diverse opportunities for the African partners. Now, what opportunities are, in your opinion, would these, with the UK or Europe in general? Because before that, before the corona, there was also an African-European summit that took place here in Sharm el-Sheikh. So what kind of opportunities would the European nation be interested in the African continent as a whole?
Well, I think...
Or has it changed, pardon me, since the corona virus?
I think I mean, first of all, you have the multilateral interests of Europe as the European Union, represented by the EU. And then you have individual nation states, and of course, each and every one of these states does have its own set of interests. For countries like the UK, for instance, I mean, Egypt can be the gateway to the rest of the African continent, if we're talking about issues, even in issues like social issues, educational development, projects in that particular field, industrial development, investments, in order to go through different African continents and countries. And you have a country like Egypt with all of its branches and strong relations with these countries. Egypt can again be a broker here in that process, working with both parties to reach more agreements, being a contractor for major projects. We see that already with a lot of MNCs working in the African continent. Having a strong regional hub in a place like Egypt can definitely be a very helpful factor for other countries.
Is it still as helpful as it would be before the UK Brexit?
Well, I think it depends on the sector. I mean, today the UK is definitely working more individually as a nation state. I mean,
would it make it much easier than when they are in a bloc?
For the UK, yes. But then also you need to be building strong ties with the EU as a whole, because this is, again, one of the main economic powers in the world today. And there's a lot of interests, again, especially in Western Africa, talking about not only the central part of the continent, but here about Western Africa. We're talking about countries like Nigeria, Ghana, Cameroon. A lot of vested interests for countries like France, for instance, there. And it's also important for Egypt to be present.
I'm glad you
mentioned.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned France, and especially apart from France being, when you talked about colonization, been most of African countries under the French control. But specifically in May last year, President Sisi took part in the Africa-France or the France-Africa Summit, and that was, of course, on the impact of coronavirus primarily on the continent and supporting the transitional period in Sudan in specific. How would you highlight the Egyptian efforts in this regard, and what will France be committed to do when it comes to Africa or Sudan in specific?
Well, France is very important because it has this very strong history and long history in the African continent, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, also even in North Africa. Colonial history, yes, but still the culture also has very important. A lot of African countries speak French as their main language. This even strengthens the ties further between France and the rest of the continent. And it's one of the, I would say maybe top 5, I think, top investors in the African continent. So having close coordination with a country like France is, again, very important because it does have an influence on these African nations. Again, the presence of France in, the Grand Sahara and in the Sahel countries like in Mali and Chad, I think it will be very difficult for Egypt to compete with that because they even have military presence in these countries and they have influence on their own internal affairs. But again, this kind of coordination is important because if Egypt, let's say, is more influential in East Africa, there needs to be also on good terms with France, who is very relevant in the western part of the continent. So working with major donors like France, like the EU, like the UK, is only in Egypt's benefit here because for these projects to take place and for these developments to take place for a very long time, without you being present on the scene and coordinating with these countries can only harm you.
What kind of level of coordination are we talking about here, Dr. Mohamed? Because, politics is a very complicated, complex issue, and there's always clash of interests. And if you want to coordinate, you need to ensure not only that you're on equal terms with everybody, but that whatever terms that you're going to agree on or conditions will not harm you. And then that becomes a very difficult equation because we're talking about a huge continent, over 50 countries, with their own problems and their own internal conflicts. As you said, there are foreign troops in certain areas. So how is that going to be, how is Egypt successful in this? Because that's something inspiring to look at, really, and how Egypt has been orchestrating this entire process for 7 years now. Yes.
Well, I think it's you will only be listened to, you only be accepted as an equal if you're relevant. So if Egypt is absent,
And if you're powerful,
of course, well, if you're relevant, then you have to be relevant for a reason. So unless Egypt is present and relevant in these places, you know, countries like France or Britain or the EU will not really listen. I mean, why would they care about Egypt if Egypt is not relevant? So that's also a very important reality, that by forging your presence in certain parts of the African continent, I mean, Egypt is, after all, a regional power that's still regaining its position. So you won't be able to be that powerful or influential all over the African continent, but in your own proximity or sort of circle of influence, in East Africa in particular, in Central Africa maybe, this is very important to build on that, because then when it comes to interests, like for instance, you know, the JERD, which is currently a major issue and a major source of, again, threat for Egypt, having the support and having the understanding of major players like France, like Britain, is very important.
In 2019, Egypt was heading the African Union, and that was also one of the greatest opportunities for Egypt to really go deep into these different files and to come closer to the problems of the African continent. But not only that, but also share its experience, the Egyptian experience on various levels. How was that useful to the African continent, and how was that beneficial for Egypt after it left its presidency?
Yeah, very important. I mean, whenever a country assumes leadership of a regional organizations like the African Union, it's only logical for it to further its own interests by pushing for its agenda. And Egypt did that by focusing on issues of terrorism, of lack of stability, of strengthening state institutions. These were the main issues that were prioritized by Egypt during its presidency of the African Union. So you will find that the rhetoric of the organization itself and the main projects that it worked on went in that direction. And more African nation states received support, or the parts of the AU that worked on these sectors were strengthened and were prioritized. So that was also very important for Egypt during this period, to further and highlight the priorities of its foreign policy, and to be also adopted by the rest of the African nations. So this is definitely, this was on the rise during the Egypt's leadership of the AU.
And Egypt has an agenda of 2030, sustainable development agenda. The African Union has a 2052, I think, or 53 agenda as well, that entitles a number of points. Seems to be there's still this wide gap between both plans or agendas, because the whole world is shifting towards sustainable development, while Africa is still trying to, you know, pick up on switching and using technology. And so, how can Egypt be able to push the African continent for it to meet on a common ground between both agendas of the African Union and the 2030?
Yes, I mean, today the momentum that the SDGs have gained really all over the world is huge. So, I mean, Egypt does have also its own challenges in terms of development. We have to, I mean, I think we all know that. But there is no harm of working multilaterally on several files, while you're working on your own also development as a nation state. And Egypt is in need of development in several sectors. You mentioned the 2030 vision. Most recently, of course, there was the initiative that was done by the government, the Good Life, or the
Decent Life, yes,
Decent
initiative.
Life. This is very important also, because you cannot possibly work on developing other nation states around you
without developing your own nation.
Unless as a nation you are also developed. And I think this is a major stride that we need to work on, and that we are already starting to see the seeds of it by focusing on the rural sector, by developing
And
the
it could actually be a
villages.
role model project that could be implemented in the other African continent on how you manage to do this transformation with the least costs possible to lift up these citizens to a decent life level.
Exactly.
Which is what most African countries need. I believe they're much more poorer than what we see here.
I think Egypt does have a lot of experiences that it can definitely, I don't want to say export, but you know, work with the African countries on different sectors. I mean, most recently, Egypt's experience, for instance, in the infrastructural sector is very important in terms of building, you know, bridges, roads, the infrastructure, electricity. water. All of these major projects, mega projects, are key for developing any kind of nation as such. And not only within the African continent. I mean, we're also today witnessing Egypt working with other Arab nations like Iraq, for instance, in that regard. And these are countries that are...
And we see the tripartite summit doing a very good job in this regard as well, Jordan, Iraq and Egypt.
Exactly. So these experiences that Egypt has developed over the past few years are definitely there also to be shared with other nations in Africa and elsewhere in the developing world, and can definitely also bear fruit for Egypt.
You know, the number one challenge is always where the money is going to come from, and Egypt is still struggling with its economic reform program. But the fact is that Egypt will not have this sufficient money to be able to, especially when it comes to infrastructure, which needs a lot of money, and it's a ABC first stage to development. Trying to attract these, whether it's the IMF or the banks and the foreign countries who would be able to donate, is also very difficult with the coronavirus and the economic crisis that hit these countries. So it becomes a very difficult equation where the money is going to come from. Where is the money going to come from in order for the African continent to be developed?
Well, I mean, the IMF and the World Bank, after all, financial institutions, they are profit-making institutions, so they don't lend
That's the
money.
thing. They need to benefit, and they need to guarantee that you will be working on these austerity measures, which they can't control in this regard to
Exactly.
such African countries.
Exactly, and they do lend money, so they don't give away money, so the money comes from them in terms of funding for projects, but there are debts that are ensued as a result, and there are debt services that should be provided to them afterwards. So, you know, financing development is definitely a key challenge, but it's also about managing these finances. Egypt here can play a major role because, after all, you know, if there's funding from the World Bank or the IMF, but the implementation takes place from a country like Egypt, the cost would definitely be much cheaper.
Or if you need to sort of push in the private sector, maybe, to be able to kick in to make this balance.
I mean, yeah, I mean, the private sector would have to be a major role here, to play a major role here, as it works in tandem also with the government. But the cost of implementing these mega projects, when you compare the cost of a partner like, you know, a French multinational company or an American one,
Much less, of
and
course.
compared with Egypt, there's definitely a lot of, I mean, benefit there, that the cost will be less, and also the social or the cultural link here, the
Very
soft power
common.
of the
Yes, of
country,
course.
does play a major role in facilitating the
Yes.
process.
We're going to go out to the second report. Today we're talking about the Egyptian-South Sudanese relations, and we'll be right back.
Egypt opens up to the world. President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi meets with world leaders.
أعبر لكم عن خالص الشكر والتقدير على حفاوة الاستقبال وكرم الضيافة.
Reaffirming Egypt's vision, delivering our voice abroad.
لتطوير التعاون الثنائي الاقتصادي والعسكري إلى مستويات غير مسبوقة.
Discussing regional and international developments. Solid and strong relations on the path of partnership and development.
Wrapping up his long visit to Egypt, South Sudan's vice president said in media remarks that the relations between Egypt and South Sudan had reached very high levels. He added that his country agreed with President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, enhancing cooperation in the fields of investment, electricity, water, health and education. Wani Iga said his country was ready for economic partnership with Egypt in various fields, adding that an international expo in Juba for Egyptian products set to be held annually. Earlier, Prime Minister Mohamed emphasized Egypt's support for the efforts exerted by South Sudan to achieve peace across the country, build on what has been reached through the revitalized peace agreement, and proceed with implementing the agreement provisions as regards the transitional phase. Egypt has been furthering its relations with South Sudan as both countries established the high-level Egypt-South Sudan Committee, coinciding with the 10th anniversary of the independence of South Sudan in July 2011. The committee is tasked with examining a range of cooperation projects between the two countries, mostly in irrigation, agriculture, healthcare and education. The committee's meetings are only one event in a steady flow of exchanges between officials in Cairo and Juba. On November 29th of 2020, President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi made a groundbreaking one-day visit to Juba, where he agreed with South Sudanese President Salva Kiir on the pursuit of strategic cooperation between the two countries. It was the first visit by an Egyptian head of state to Juba since the independence of South Sudan on July 9th of 2011, after a referendum on the separation of South Sudan and Sudan conducted in the second week of January the same year. For Egypt, Sudan and South Sudan are the closest of the Nile Basin countries, and obviously irrigation and water cooperation are key. South Sudan is a country with many water resources, but it is still working on building up its expertise in water management. In June, Minister of Irrigation Mohamed said that Egypt had signed a technical cooperation protocol with South Sudan to prepare a draft for feasibility studies for the construction of the multi-purpose Wow Dam in South Sudan. In general, Egypt and South Sudan relations have been developing very well, and they are set to move forward on many fronts at the same time.
Welcome back again. You're still watching us here on The Daily Debate. Still have one final question, 2 minutes to go. Dr. Mohamed Fahmy, a professor of political science at the American University in Cairo. And it's very difficult to just put this question in 2 minutes, but if I would say, what is the key word, if you would put it in a sentence or in a keyword that the African continent needs at the moment in order for it to really make a difference and move forward in on very solid ground and on concrete ground?
One word.
One word, one sentence. You have 2 minutes to go.
Well, I think African integration is very important. African integration for the nations of the country, of the continent, to work together. First regionally, within their own regions, whether East Africa, that's an example that we talked about today, North Africa, and other Central and Southern and West Africa. These 5 main regions, I think there is a lot of room there for integration within the regions in the continent.
And does integration happen within the leadership first or within the nations itself?
Well, both. I mean, stability first and foremost within their own borders, but also working together regionally, because you cannot really reach African integration as a whole within the continent unless you have this level of regional understanding. This can only be the springboard for a later stage of African integration as a whole.
Can we say that the nations are a much more on a high awareness level today than they were 10, 20, 30 years ago?
Well, some of them are. But again, the picture is really, I mean, we have to also understand that Africa is a very diverse continent, really, and that the picture differs from one country to another. And that's why we're saying, we're highlighting that the regional integration is first important within the countries that are close to each other, that have similar challenges, because this will only help then in a bigger picture of integration throughout the continent.
Perfect. Our time is up. I'd like to thank you once again very much, Dr. Mohamed Fahmy, Professor of Political Science at the American University in Cairo. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thanks a lot.
That brings us to the end of our episode of The Daily Debate. The top stories will be coming up next. I'm Yasmin Bakir signing off. Thank you for watching.